Xavier Gabaix to present Behavioral New Keynesian Model. And Xavier, the floor is all yours now.
Great. Until in 57 or so minutes. That's right?
Yes, that's right.
Your time. Okay, great.
Yes,
okay.
That's right.
So thanks a lot for having me. First, for me, this kind of web seminar, I think it's a great concept, and I hope the idea gets refined and propagated, so it's a new norm. Great. So here, what I'm doing in this paper, I'm writing a behavioral theory of a Galli textbook, if you want, of the main chapters of a Galli textbook, which is the main textbook of New Keynesian economics. So monetary policy, and also with those behavioral agents, it's easy to also add fiscal policy to the mix. And so the agents will be behavioral in a way, I'll make very clear, but so, you know, they're very patient. So, but however, they will be myopic to small future disturbances. So on average, they're well calibrated, they're patient, they consume and save patiently. But if you tell them there will be a small change in the interest rate or income or whatever in 10 years, they don't really think that much about that. Okay. Part of the issue will be how do you model that. Okay. The rational model will always be a particular case of my model. And okay, so why would you do that? So first, if people truly are not rational, clearly our models should incorporate that, and even more, perhaps urgently, our policies should incorporate that. Now, there's also a number of empirical issues with the New Keynesian models for guidance puzzle and others. And another we will come back to. So it looks like, take Japan. So Japan has been at the ZLB, zero lower bound, for maybe 25 years now. And if you are the ZLB, it means many things, but one of them is your interest. You cannot decrease the interest rate if you have a deflation. So your Taylor rules coefficients are basically zero. But then if your Taylor rule coefficients are zero, then you contradict the Taylor principles that says it should be bigger than one. And so the economy should be indeterminate. It means, in particular, maybe you should jump randomly from one equilibrium to the next and lost instability. But you don't really see that at all in the real world. So there's something, another empirically painful, problematic things about the New Keynesian model. And so the bounded rationality will be one way to fix that. So it will be one main assumption about some sort of cognitive myopia that will explain lots of things at the same time. But that's the idea. So to be more precise, so what we're going to get, so this behavioral version of the workhorse New Keynesian model, in terms of more substantive conclusions, so monetary policy will be less powerful. So things like forward guidance in particular will be less powerful. However, fiscal policy will be more powerful. And that's because those agents, they will not be Ricardian. Okay, so those agents, you give them 1,000 euros today. They say, wow, great, I get the check, and they will spend some of it, but they don't really see that their taxes the 1,000 euros will be taken back with interest in the next 20 years, or they only partially see that. So as a result, they spend some of the check you send them. So that's how fiscal policy is, more powerful, because it has zero power in the New Keynesian model. When I talk about fiscal policy here, it will be all government transfers, not there's always zero government consumption. You can actually work out the joint optimal and fiscal policy. There will be a nice interaction. So the Taylor principle will be very strongly modified. And in particular, even if you're stuck at the ZLB for a long time or forever, the equilibrium will be determinate. So you don't have Taylor rules issues. Also, the ZLB will be much less costly. For some more refined policy issues, you had, okay, so typically you want to do helicopter drops of money because you use the fiscal instrument. And also somewhat more refined, you have, in the New Keynesian model, you have a policy that's called price level targeting. that under many conditions is actually optimal, and nominal GDP targeting, a close cousin of that, is also optimal. It's not the case anymore with behavioral agents, and it's actually strongly not optimal to do that. So we'll go there. I see okay, and we've lost our friends from the OH, so I don't know if that's a big deal, but anyway, I'll let you. The last panel has disappeared. I don't know. Anyway, and then later I talk, time permitting, about neo-Fischerian debates. The idea that maybe to raise the long-term interest rates, you should, to raise long-run expectation about inflation, you should raise the interest rates. And I will not endorse that, except in the very long run, and we'll be able to think about what this means anyway. And there's also now, in the new version of the paper that's not yet on the web, Bayesian estimation I'm going to show you, supporting the main contention of this model empirically. Great. So I relate to quite a bit of literature, mostly in attention. And what I'm going to do is behavioral inattention, or like rational inattention. Anyway, it makes a big difference for some things. And there's a big literature on the forward guidance puzzle. So here, it will be, in some sense, one more model with a forward guidance puzzle, but you get many more things with one assumption. And I would say it's the most tractable model by some distance for all those things. So that's, okay. And for those of you who, I don't know, I don't know what I'm doing these days. So these days I'm obsessively, so 3 years ago I knew nothing about New Keynesian economics or anything, but I've learned, okay, I can learn. But I'm obsessively thinking about bounded rationality, and I have only one paper now published, but I'm working hard doing, where you can have something called a sparse max. Anyway, you can do all the basics of micro with bounded rationality. So it's a form of inattention, if you want, but really simplification of the world. And you can do like your basic variant and Maskell-Winston Green, all those things with bounded rationality. So this is something that other modeling technologies really can't do, because it seems is way too complicated and other things just don't apply. And so anyway, I'm also working on how you do optimal policy in general with behavioral agents, a paper with Emmanuel Fari, and there are others. Anyway, so that's and a lot of the modeling choices, they rest on a prior paper called Behavioral Macro via Sparse Dynamic Programming, where I try to have a modeling technology that applies to lots of things at the same time. Anyway, so that's part of what guides me for some modeling choices. Anyway. Good. So okay, so getting started. Just the notations for now. So this is the traditional model that all of you probably know. So you have xt will be the output gap. So xt equals 0, you're just at the optimum. Xt positive, you have a boom. Xt negative, you have a slump. Pi t will be inflation, and then this is just the straight New Keynesian model, behavioral version soon. In the traditional model, output depends on future output with equation 1 for 1. But if you have a high interest rates, that's the high R hat t, it lowers output, and inflation depends on future inflation positively, and also on current output. So booms create some inflation, and there's a fairly long actually derivation you can do in Gali. And so here I'm going to extend the derivation with different micro assumptions to behavioral agents. Okay, so let's get started. So this is the microeconomic assumptions for this kind of worldview. So you get if it's a representative agent, the government does not consume anything, but may do transfers in the central bank. So you have an agent with a completely conventional utility function, like in Woodford and Gali. And first, let me write here the objective law of motions of the world, and then we'll talk about the subjective representation that the agent has. So KT will be the private amount of capital. In equilibrium, that's going to be 0, because in this New Keynesian model, there's 0 aggregate capital. It's not central, but it just simplifies stuff. And so KT is my wealth. So I get on average an income Y bar, but also I get a deviation of income Y hat T. So all the hats will be deviations from a steady state. There's no growth, by the way, in a steady state. It's just a normalization, really. So, okay. And then I consume CT and I invest my money at the bank. The bank on average gives me an interest rate R bar, that's real. But there's a deviation R hat from the equilibrium. And all of those quantity depends on the, there's a big state vector, big XT, bolded XT. So it's a state vector that comprises TFP level, and also maybe policy announcements and modification of the Taylor rule, perhaps lots of things. So think in equilibrium, there's an objective law of motion for the XT with this G. And then, by the way, what's my income? My income at period T depends on the wage, omega, as a real wage. NT is my labor supply, like number of hours worked. YFT, it's the profit from firms, because I will have those Stiglitz firms. On average, we have zero profits. There's a tax ensuring that. But they may have, deviations, non-zero profit depending on the state of the business cycle. Okay, so that's my personal income. Okay, so this is the objective world. And now in the baseline version of the model, well, I will always say, now I want to capture some form of cognitive myopia where the agent does not fully, it's hard to anticipate fully what's going to happen in, say, 5 years. So here I'm going to say the way I model it here, it's a little bit of a reduced form. And there are lots of micro foundations in the appendix of a paper. So I say the perceived law of motion for XT, that's this last equation, this spread equation here. It's the objective law of motion of the world in equilibrium, but times this M bar in red. So M bar is like between 0 and 1. So M bar equals 1, that's the rational model. And M bar strictly less than 1, it's going to be, I don't fully, when I model the future XT, I shrink it towards 0. So in some sense, I don't fully react to future XT plus 1, XT plus 2. Okay, and I'm going to expand on that very soon in the next slide. But so just to close the loop here, what the behavioral agent does, he maximizes his utility function, subject to what's above, but using this subjective law of motion for the state vector of the world. Okay, so now let's unpack this state vector to see what this means. Okay, so to have a good intuition for it, let me linearize this equation, having d mean xt so that the steady state mean is 0. So I just linearize the previous equation. So M bar is the same cognitive discounting factor. So if I take the expectation of the law of motion, I get, I'm a behavioral agent, and I look at my expected value of xt plus 1 under my bounded rational expectations that have this M bar. So it's going to be M bar times gamma, this matrix, times xt. And if I iterate k times, my expectation about the vector xt k periods, that's some gamma, something times M bar to the k. So it means the more it's in the future, the more I discount it. And now I could have the same equation now if I was a rational agent. And so then my rational expectation of xt in k period would be, well, gamma to the kxt. So if I link the two, now I have this equation, the third equation here. My bounded rational expectation of a vector in k period, it's the rational expectation of a vector in k periods, but times this M bar to the k. So substantially, it means when I think about the state vector in k period, I kind of have rational expectations, but they're dampened with the factor M bar to the k. Okay, so it means that maybe I perceive fairly well the state vector today, but if you ask me to predict things in 5 years, it's very confusing. In some sense, it's very confusing to me. Okay, and I shrink that towards 0. By the way, the shrinking towards 0 is not very essential. In the appendix, I have other, you can shrink towards other things. it doesn't really change things actually. What's important is you shrink towards something, so you're less sensitive to far away stuff. And so, for instance, we had this interest rate R hat, so that's the deviation of interest rate from the mean. If I linearize, it's going to be a linear function of a state vector. So applying the last equation, it means my bounded rational expectation of R hat, so deviation of interest rate from the mean in k period, is going to be the rational expectation times m bar to the k. So again, if interest rate, the real here, interest rate varies by a certain amount in 5 years, I will react to that by m bar to the power of 5. Okay, so I react less in the sense to the disturbance of interest rate in k periods.
So can I ask you a question?
Yeah, of course, of course.
So if you have something like extrapolative expectations, can you capture that too, or this would be an m larger than 1?
So great question. So I work it out in the appendix. Let me go to the next slide. I'm going to answer your question there. Okay. So that will be useful. So no, but I will tell you what it will be. Okay. So at the end of the slide, I will be able to. So please ask me if I forget. But okay. So now that's like the most streamlined version with just one free parameter. Okay. Now for other things, for some, so you can do 90% of the paper with just that. Now for other things, including like details of empirical fit and all that, it's useful to have a little more to enrich the model. And you need that useful to do it the following ways. So I'm to say maybe in the subjective law of maybe the agent does not fully incorporate income or even interest rate in a slightly richer way. So for instance here, for the interest rate, I allow the agent to have this bounded rational perception of the interest rate. And it's the rational, it's the interest rate we had written before, but times this MR. So MR means even today's interest rate, I may not fully pay attention to it. Okay, and it captures that. I don't know about you, but you know, when you, at least for me, if I buy a new, a new shirt, I don't really think about the interest rate now to make sure I'm on my Euler equation for shirts and all that. So it captures that. Even for current interest rates, agents may not fully pay attention to it. Okay, and now you can have the same thing for income, where when I even think about current income, I may not fully pay attention to current income, and so that would be a little my. That's like a dampening parameters in front of a current income. Okay, in the rational case, it's always all the m's are equal to 1. So what does it give you? It gives you. So let's look at the interest rate. So let's look at this equation here. It says my expected value for me at time t of the future interest rate in k periods. It's my perception of interest rate. Okay, but it's all in deviations from the average interest rate. So I always perceive the average interest rate R bar, say 2%. Well, okay, but the deviations from it, if it's in k periods, I will have the rational perceptions, but times MR times this M bar to the power k. So we get the cognitive discounted we've seen just 3 minutes ago, where if it's in 5 periods, discounted with M bar to the 5, okay? But also the current interest rate, it may itself not think fully about it. So that will be this MR. And it's something that I think wants to be called a term structure of attention. So it's, I don't fully pay attention to current things. And the more it's in the future, that's the MR, and the intercept of attention. And the more it's in the future, the less I pay attention to it. That's the M bar to the K. Okay? And I don't have a lot of evidence for the existence of a term structure of attention. But once you think about it, it makes sense there would be one. There will be some attention for things today, some attention for things in 5 years, and then some slope in between. And nobody has tried to measure a term structure of attention. Though in the paper now I talk about existing papers that have some evidence, a little consistent with that, but it would be nice to calibrate those things very systematically. I don't do that here, but in parts there's just natural concepts that once you write them down, they cry for some estimation. I will do some macro estimation, but I don't have micro estimation. So you can do the same thing.
Question. Sorry, Xavier.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
K is to the power of K, or is this a superscript?
No. So this is to the power K. So
but
yeah.
then so the beta delta formulation, is this by intention that you have timing consistency built in?
Sorry. Can you say it again? Sorry, Marcus.
It's a little bit like the hyperbolic discounting where you have this beta delta formulation. No?
Yeah. So it's a little bit. So
but
the intention
is timing consistency in it.
Yeah. So there will be time consistency, but it will not create any difficult problem to solve the model. Okay, because to use that analogy, it would be like a naive agent, if you want, in some sense. Okay.
But you want
a perception of a world
exponential then from tomorrow onwards.
That's right, exactly. So it's for the same reason as the beta delta, which is it's computationally convenient to have these exponentials. You know, exponentials are convenient, and anything else is a pain when you have dynamic models. Okay, but a big difference with hyperbolic discounting is a hyperbolic discounting agent is globally impatient. Okay, whereas my agent, so has high marginal propensity to consume out of wealth. Whereas my agent is globally patient. On average, he's totally the rational agent. Just for deviations in the future, he doesn't perceive well them fully. Okay, that's one thing. And then another, you can have, it could be that I'm very attentive to my current income, but not very attentive to current interest rates. So, you know, it gives you more, maybe more nuanced way of various cognitive failures of people. Okay, and now let me now go to Marcus's question from last slide. You could easily add something like extrapolative expectations in the sense, in a precise sense, which is, so here when I project my future income, I de facto anchor it on, for my projection of my income in 5 years, I anchor it on, my income will come back on the steady state income at Y bar. It's all in deviations from Y bar. But maybe you could say I anchor on the present. So maybe I will anchor on the current income. So that would be a form of extrapolative expectations. Okay? When I project my future income, I anchor the present income and not future income. And that would be very easy to add. You would just add plus some weight on current income, and I do that in one of the online appendices. And it's going to change the micro behavior of the agent, but basically you get a bigger impact of current transfers, okay, or current income on current consumption. But it turns out it essentially doesn't really change the macro behavior. It just change the details of some parameters, but not the shape of all the system. Anyway. So what is that? It's meant to be a fairly easy to extend structure with a very, I think, quite parsimonious core, which is this M bar. But you can extend it in a variety of fairly easy ways. Okay, so I've already spent 25 minutes on the macro foundation. So let me go to the more, you know.
Sorry, can I ask them?
Of course.
You estimate the variance going forward, no? Because you always shrink it towards zero.
Yeah, but this model, it will be all linearized.
I see. So
I don't get any
savings, it should have a big impact if you think the world is less than it actually is.
That's right. So here, I don't consider that, but it's true an agent like that would sort of underestimate the variance and would not have enough precautionary savings. And maybe that's correct, actually. But I don't talk about that in this paper. Okay, so just in the interest of time, let me accelerate a little bit the pace, okay? And so what do you get? So let me stay with this microeconomic agent. So now, so this was what he does. He maximizes his straightforward traditional utility function with this, you know, different perception of a law of motion. So what's going to happen for his consumption? This is his private consumption function or consumption policy. His consumption will depend, like the rational model, on present value of future income. Oh, that's fair. Present value of future interest rate, but they are discounted by this cognitive discount factor, this M bar over there. Okay. Now for his wealth, he still very patiently consume his wealth. That's not affected by how much is MPC out of wealth. That's not affected by cognitive factors because he sees his current wealth. But future income, future interest rate, they're affected by this cognitive discount factor. Okay. Great. So this is what the agent does. So now in partial equilibrium, now let me do general equilibrium and say in equilibrium, consumption will be equal to income because it's a closed economy with no government, no investment, there's no capital. Also, let me now talk a bit more of notation. XT will be the output gap. So it's log output minus log ideal output if you removed all pricing frictions. And DT will be, will allow in an extension the government to have active fiscal policy and have lump sum taxes and tax rebates. So DT will be the deficit of a government after interest rate on the debt. Anyway. Okay, so let me close the model. So here now I close the model by having consumption, future income being future aggregate demand, aggregate consumption. Let me not do the derivation here, but basically is you say consumption equals income. You close the loop. It's just one little slide of algebra. And what you get here is that your XT, your output gap, is going to be the future output gap minus this kind of interest rate gap, but real interest rate minus natural interest rate. But then it's times some M, and this M over there, it's this M bar, the cognitive discounting, divided by a factor very close to 1. I could elaborate on it. So it means that because of this micro level cognitive discounted, you have also macro level discounting in this output gap. So sometimes called a discounted Euler equation. Is output gap depends on future output gap with this discounting parameter M that's endogenous, and also you also react to future interest rates in a somewhat dampened way, but that's a bit of a detail. Okay, and why is that important? Is because suppose I iterate forward. That's the whole subliterature on discounted Euler equation. My output gap will depend on the discounted value of future interest rates gaps. That's deviation between true real interest rate and natural real interest rates, which will be the interest rate in the underlying kind of RBC economy, frictionless. But if you had a rational model, this big M would be 1. And then you would get, the output gap would depend on the undiscounted value of future interest rate gaps. So if there's a disturbance of interest rate in 1,000 periods, it will have the same impact as a disturbance of interest rate in 1 period. And that's like the forward guidance puzzle. So anyway, that sounds very implausible. And so you get that because of this cognitive discounting in this literature. Okay, so now let me not talk about this. Now let me talk briefly about the firms, not the details. So the firms will do the same. So I allow the firms also to have this kind of cognitive discounting. And so the firms, they will not fully pay attention to all these future state vector in exactly the same way we've seen for consumers. And also, and that's just a refinement, when they price, when they do their optimal, their Calvo firms, but behavioral Calvo firms, when they do their optimal pricing, they may not fully pay attention to inflation and current conditions. So the way it works out, let me just flag a few things in the model. So if you work the rational firm, when you choose your optimal real, and you can change your price today, when you change your real price, you want to change this expected value of your future profits or your rational profits. And the behavior of a firm does the same thing, except it's going to maximize the discounted value under the bounded rational expectation. And I see there's a typo here. It should be under the bounded rational expectation here for the firms. Okay, and once you do that, you get that the optimal pricing rule depends on discount future inflation, like in the traditional model, but again with the same cognitive discounting factor. Okay, and maybe some weight, not 1-for-1 on inflation. Okay, again, so this is I go because of lack of time. I'm going a little fast on that, but anyway, so the firms are like the consumers. They lack the rational firms, except with a bit of cognitive discounting. And also, when they think about future profits, they may not put a weight of 1-for-1 on inflation, and they may not put a weight on 1-for-1 on all the macroeconomic disturbances. And that would be a little useful later for some details of the calibration. Okay.
And then, Xavier,
yeah.
So are you going to show us how this is potentially micro-founded with like a rational inattention type model like we know it, or you said this is in the appendix, but are you going to spend some time on this, or?
So I'm not going to spend some time on it here because actually I don't even have a slide on that, but it's lovingly in the appendix, especially in the new version that's not yet on the web. I'm revising it intensely now. It should be up maybe in 2 weeks. Okay, but let me tell you how it works. So first, it's not rational inattention a la Sims, okay? Because basically, suppose you have a one-factor model a la Sims, and that's really important. Like, let me go back to the consumer problem. Suppose there's just TFP in the model. So if it's a la Sims, I'm a Bayesian agent, but I have some imperfect information. So a la Sims, if I know, given that a one-factor model, if I know income, I know all the other variables in the model forever and ever. Okay, I know all. If I know current income, I know all the future. I know everything about the interest rate and all that because it's a one-factor model. It's truly the word one factor. So it doesn't allow you to even capture. I'm attentive to somewhat attentive to the present, but less to the future. Okay, except if you. Again, it's because of the strength of the power of the Bayesian updating throughout the whole worldview. Okay, so here it's where my sparsity line comes in. It's not a Bayesian agent, so a little different. But now, otherwise, you can also endogenize parameters in a somewhat similar way. It's actually much easier to endogenize because, again, the agents are not Bayesian, so there's some tricks. Anyway, you could do it, and then you would get the comparative statistics that makes sense. So if the world is more volatile, say if the real interest rate is more volatile, I pay more attention to the real interest rate. If inflation becomes more volatile, I pay more attention, the firms will pay more attention to inflation. So that little parameter here will be higher. You get that, okay? So I don't pursue it in the paper, but anyway, I state how it could be done. Actually, I do it, but I don't draw implications from it. Okay, so now, conclusion. So then what you do once you have this microeconomic equation in the traditional model, you put all those firms in general equilibrium, you do 5 pages of algebra and you get the GE. So this is what you get here. I don't show you the algebra. So you get these 2 equation representation of the world. That's like the rational model, but with some behavioral dimensions. So let's look at that. Now,
Xavier, can I ask you a question?
Yeah,
I mean, you're linearizing at some steady state, I suspect, right? And
yes.
I wonder whether you have to adopt some assumptions about the M parameters for the households and the firms, such that this steady state is efficient after all.
Great. No, great question. So here, the way this whole research is done, it's so that in attention, it doesn't change at all the steady state. So, and why was that? Let's go back to the consumer. The consumer, he fully perceives the true real interest rate. The true average real interest rate, R bar. It fully perceives the true average income, okay? And he's fully patient. So the steady state does not change. What changes is what's perturbed by the research is the perception of a deviation from the steady state. So that's the assumption.
And that is, you get this because you assume that basically the guy has a perceived law of motion, and you don't write any modifications in, say, the utility function or something like this.
In the what, sorry, function?
In the utility function, say.
Yeah,
or
the utility function is completely the traditional utility function, exactly.
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
It's not like a beta delta would modify the utility function. Now here, I keep the utility function, I keep the steady state the same. It's just the perceptions, the cognitive perception of deviations that are different.
Okay, thanks.
A small modification at some point, but it makes life actually much easier. Anyway. Okay, so let's describe a little bit the steady state and look at consequences for positive implications and policy. So the output depends on future output with discounting. So in red, you have parameters that are different compared to the traditional model. So output depends on future output with this discounting parameter. Also, I will not talk much more about that, but deficits, in the extension, I just chose not to show you in detail because of lack of time. If the government runs a deficit, it has a stimulative impact because agents, they see the money that comes to them and they don't really see the taxes that will be taken later. So you have the deficit DT will have a stimulative impact. Here you see the equation for the BD. So if M bar is equal to 1, that's the rational model, then the BD is 0. Deficits don't have any impact, but as soon as the M bar is less than 1, you get an impact, stimulative impact of deficits. And now for the inflation, inflation depends on future inflation, like in the traditional model, but with beta, that's the pure rate of time preference. And it's just that in the traditional model, but in this behavioral model, it's multiplied by this MF, and MF, it's some sort of macro parameter of attention to future inflation. And it depends on the micro parameter of attention to inflation and a number of things like the Calvo degree of price stickiness and all that. Okay, so it's a strict generalization of a rational model. If you give me only one free parameter, I just want the M bar. And otherwise, the other parameters are, I think, a little conceptually useful anyway. And there's some empirical support for all those deviations for a traditional model. So when people estimate the Phillips curve, maybe Galli-Gertler and others, they see the Phillips curve is not that forward-looking. So you want an MF maybe 0.8. When here, there's a paper through Rodebush. When they estimate future, the IS curve, they say, no, it's not that forward-looking, maybe it's 0.6. The forward guidance should also on less than 1. Ricardian equivalence doesn't fully hold, so the BD should be strictly positive empirically. So you get those things at least qualitatively in this model, and there's also calibration where you get them quantitatively. Yeah. So now let's look at the consequences of that. Okay, so the bottom line, you get a parsimonious deviation from the traditional model with basically one main free parameter, and it's very easy to work out, and you have representative agent, it's very close, it's all in closed form, so it's much easier than other modeling devices, let's say. Okay, so now let's look at some consequences. So one is the Taylor principle will be modified a lot. So just a notation. So IT is the nominal interest rate set by the central bank. It follows the Taylor rule with a weight phi on current inflation and phi x on output, but let me omit that, and maybe there's an intercept. Okay, the question is, when is the equilibrium determinate or not? And let's remind ourselves, what's a determinate equilibrium? So you can rewrite the previous two-equation model in the following way. ZT is the state vector made of output, gap, and inflation. And you can write it this way: ZT, it's future ZT with some matrix A plus some intercept. And let me say it in baby words what the equilibrium determinacy mean. Once you have a forward-looking equation like that, you'd like to say, well, ZT is the present value of future BTs discounted by A to the some power. But you can only do that if, in a one-dimensional model, if A is less than 1 in absolute value. But if it's a matrix, it would be all the eigenvalues of A should be less than 1 in modulus. So that's equilibrium determinacy. When is it that you have that, okay? And so that's what gives the traditional Taylor criterion. So let's do that for this behavioral model. When do you get all the eigenvalues less than 1? When you get a determinate equilibrium. And so here's the result. I just show it with the one-dimensional Taylor rule, just for, to be compact here. You can extend, and I do it. Okay, so this is, you have equilibrium determinacy if and only if. So in the traditional model, if only this equation holds. So you get, in the traditional model, big M is equal to 1, full attention. And so you get, if and only if, phi pi, the quotient in inflation, is bigger than 1. That's the Taylor principle. In this model with behavioral agents, big M is less than 1, okay? And so this new term is non-zero. And so it will mean, in particular, suppose that monetary policy is passive. So it means phi pi is equal to 0. the nominal rate is always maybe 0% or 0.5% or whatever. Okay. So then you get that in the traditional model, you violate the Taylor principle. So equilibrium is indeterminate. But in this model, you can get a determinate equilibrium if and only if the right term is bigger than 1. Okay. And basically what it means is if agents are boundedly rational enough, if big M is less than 1. And also prices are sticky enough, by the way, but that's a detail. Okay. And on quantitative grounds, basically, as soon as M is not 0.99, this is bigger than 1. You know, it's very easy for this term to be big as long as M is not exactly equal to 1. Okay. So this is my story, if you want, for why do you have Japan, etc., not exploding, you know, that, or being indeterminate. Is because people are not that smart trying to guess potential new multiple equilibria, and they just anchor a lot on the present. And then if you do that, you have only one equilibrium. That's what it means, you know, in plain terms. Okay. But there's a message of hope. You know, you won't get those deflationary spirals or indeterminacy and all that. Let me keep going. So this determinacy issue, it works for, you know, literally infinitely long-lasting being at the ZLB, being with a stock monetary policy. It turns out you can have a more finite version of that, and it would be if you had the ZLB for many periods. Okay, the softer version of that would be if you had the ZLB for captive periods. If you were in the traditional model, you would get that current conditions will be extremely sensitive to future conditions after the ZLB, it turns out. So you can also reject that view. And that's exactly for the same reason that the eigenvalues will be bigger than 1. Anyway, so even if you say, look, the ZLB issue is nonsense because anyway, we'll be at the ZLB for a finite amount of time, even then, the softer counterpart of the equilibrium will be indeterminate becomes any change in your prediction, but what happens after the ZLB, in the rational model, we have infinitely high, actually, unboundedly high impacts on current conditions, and that's you know, not true in the behavioral model. Anyway. And one way to see that, if you had the ZLB in the traditional model for many periods, that will have an unboundedly high impact on the output gap. So this is like from learning in the rational model. In the rational model, if you know the same calibration with the two models, except on the right, it's a behavioral model with M less than 1, I think it's 0.8 anyway. But in the rational model, you would get an unboundedly high output gap, maybe minus 80% output gap, when in the this behavioral model, you get a moderate and finite output gap. So again, much more like the real world. Okay. Also, you get the forward guidance puzzle. Now, a number of other papers get it, but here this way you get it, and you get many other things with this model. And the forward guidance puzzle says, amongst other things, if you announce an interest rate cut in say 60 periods, that will have a much bigger impact on inflation than if you announce it in 1 period, maybe a 50 times bigger impact, which is sounds a bit crazy. In this model, actually, you get indeed a much lower impact if you announce an interest rate cut that will happen in 50 periods, than if it's in 1 period. Again, because agents are not that smart and don't really think that hard about what will happen in 50 periods, to put it plainly.
And how do you get the hump, Xavier?
Okay, and the hump, it's because you still get a little bit of the effect of a rational model. So in the rational model, it's still, if I announce the cut in 4 periods, there's a direct impact, but there's also indirect impact because people anticipate that consumption will be a little higher for the next 4 periods, and that has a cumulative impact on inflation now, because inflation is forward-looking. So you still get a little bit of that, the shadow of that rational effect, but then it's very quickly taken over by the cognitive discounting, if you want.
What little m's do you assume for these things?
So I assume a big M of 0.8, and basically big M and little m are basically the same thing. And I will show calibration, a Bayesian estimation. I've been doing that. with this, and it's pretty a high amount of discounting. So 0.8, it's 0.8 per quarter. Okay, so it means that they're really not that forward-looking. But anyway, this is what
0.8 times to the power of 4 is that's
maybe I should know it, but maybe 0.2 or 0.3. Yeah, so it's quite.
I see they're very myopic.
Yeah, here, you know, maybe anyway. This is what the calibration, the estimate is 0.85. Sorry. Anyway, so it's a bit less bad, but that's what the calibration, the Bayesian estimation will give you.
But
Now,
you're not using any forecasts in the calibration, because we know that forecasts by professional forecasters, for example, are substantially less volatile than the underlying series, and you have a whole term structure of expectations.
That's
so
right.
We could use those potentially to calibrate this thing.
But so I talk a little bit about that. But what's really important here is the forecast by a random consumer choosing his consumption. This is how much that consumer thinks about the future, not how a forecaster, a professional forecaster. Okay, so I have 12 more minutes. Let me give you a taste of the rest just to, okay. Now you can do optimal monetary policy. So the welfare criterion is basically the same. So it's welfare under the rational expectation. That's what I take as the welfare criterion. And so you get some weight on inflation and output gap. The weight on an output gap become much bigger than the slope in the traditional model. Is just the slope of Phillips curve divided by the elasticity of demand. Here it's actually bigger. But let me not explain why, but let me just say that. Okay. Anyway. Okay, so what should be the first best policy? At the first best, like in the rational model, you would like to have zero inflation, zero output gap. And so if you look at the equation here, it means that this whole thing should be equal to 0. And so what it means is, so typically you would say you run 0 deficits, and then your interest rate is just the natural rate of interest, like in the traditional, like Wixel, Fisher model, okay? But now, if you run deficits, then actually you want to increase the interest rate to counteract the stimulative impact of deficits, like in an old Keynesian model, by the way.
So Xavier, you ignore this monopolistic feature? That's like
no, I don't ignore it at all. So, but I said I do like the rational people. Okay, there's a tax on there's a subsidy to inputs to the wage, if you want, so that in the steady state there's no distortion of production.
Oh, okay.
So all the distortion end up being second order distortions as a deviation from the steady state. That's okay. That's what I do. Again, like many other people, like Gali and company. Okay, so now.
So and why do you take the rational the model's welfare criterion? I mean, that seems a little bit.
No, it's actually there are lots of wonderful ethical debates, and actually Marcus has a paper on that about that. So here I'm much less I'm not sophisticated at all. I say, look, what matters is ultimately how much they will consume, how much they will save. Sorry, they will work. Okay. Not at all how much they savor the future because of their cognitive illusions. You could argue that on some other ethical grounds, but here it's, you know, what's the actual consumption, what's the actual output in the economy. That's the criteria I use it. You could change it, but anyway, to keep the paper finite, I use the plainest criterion, maybe. Anyway. Okay. But I'm cognizant of the fact it can be much more enriched, but anyway, that's not what I do here. Okay, now suppose now you add the ZLB. So how do you want to add the ZLB? In the Eggerson-Woodford tradition, you say, for some reason, the natural rate of maybe patient people become much more impatient, and the natural rate of interest becomes strongly negative. Maybe it's -3%. And then by and large, you cannot have nominal interest rate of -3%. So very complicated in the traditional model. You have a complicated second best optimal policies. In this model, it's actually a very simple policy because you have two instruments. And so the optimal policy becomes, for instance, there are several, but one of them is basically you run the deficits. Okay, so maybe at the Bundesbank you will not love that, but anyway, this is what the logic of this model with zero distortionary taxation gives you. Okay, you run the deficits that stimulates the economy, okay, because those agents are not Ricardian, and then you're actually exactly at zero output gap. And for instance, you could have zero nominal interest rates, but you could have something else if you wanted. But what you need is to run the deficits. Okay, so I'm not necessarily endorsing that because I am cognizant of the fact you have actually distortionary taxation, but this is what the logic of that simple model gives you. Okay. A couple more things I should go through. So this is very optimistic because you end up getting the first best. What happens if you can't get the first best? So again, in like Gali chapter 4, you would say there's a cost push shock. So what's a cost push shock? In the equations, you get in the Phillips curve, it's an extra disturbance, new T term, maybe it's an AR1 that shifts around your Phillips curve. In the macro foundation, it could be some time varying elasticity of demand that changes the optimal market. Anyway, okay, so then you cannot have the first best because you cannot have pi t equals xt equals 0 forever. But you can still have an optimal second best policy. And in the traditional model, the optimal second best policy gives you price level targeting. So let me illustrate it here. It's in blue. So the rational model is in blue. So you have the original, the exogenous impulse is the new, there's a cost push shock new, that's positive at time 0, then it's a decaying AR1. And then you run in blue the optimal policy given that, and it gives you that at the optimum, you get the price level goes up initially, and then mean reverse to the steady state value, not to the steady state, to the initial value later. Okay, so you always have the same constant price level actually, okay, in the traditional model. So it means after inflation, you engineer a deflation to go back to the sacrosanct price level target. Okay, and now in this behavioral model, that's not the case anymore. So here in red, I work out the optimal policy of a rational central bank, but the central bank knows agents are not rational, okay? And then you get at the optimum, you still raise interest rate after the cost push, but you kind of bygones are bygones. You know, the price level will be higher forever, and that's okay. That's the optimum, the best you can do. Okay, so I was agnostic about nominal GDP targeting or not, but now I'm kind of strongly against it because it's rational. It's optimal only if you have very rational firms actually, but not otherwise. Okay, and by the way, it's the rationality of firms that matter here. Here the MF, not the rationality of consumers, as it turns out. Okay, let me show now in the last 5 minutes a few things that I want to leave some time for questions too. So I do prompted by seminar audiences, my referees, DSG, a Bayesian estimation of that. And so for that, it's useful to have, especially if you want to have a 60s and 70s, not really if you want to have everything after 1985, but for before. So implicitly, this model has zero trend inflation. You know, when firms anchor in their cognitive discounting, they anchor at zero trend inflation. But what happens if you have non-zero trend inflation? So in section 5 of the paper, I do an extension with non-zero trend inflation. And then I say there's a default inflation they have in their mind. It's like a chip signal in the Bayesian literature. And the chip signals comes from an average of past inflation and then past central bank guidance for inflation. So if the central bank says our target is 2%, 2%, 2%, the pi TCB is 2%, basically. Okay. And so what I say in the extension of the model is you anchor in your beliefs, you anchor inflation, you make it go to default inflation. And also I do indexation because for some details of the calibration is useful anyway. And so then you get exactly the same model as before, except now inflation is this pi hat plus default inflation. And pi hat, and the equation we had seen before for the Phillips curve, it's all in the pi hat space. It's all about default inflation. So it's default, sorry, deviations from default inflation. So before, default inflation was 0. And in general, if you have this default trend inflation coming from the past and the central bank guidance, all the forward-looking behavior, it's about the deviation from default inflation. Anyway, and that embeds all Keynesian model, new Keynesian models. Anyway, so I estimate it with a Bayesian method. So I'm going to report the base factor. So the base factor is like the log likelihood of the model compared to the log likelihood of a rational model, but with a penalty for the extra number of parameters. Like, you know, I have M, an extra M or MF power 3 parameter. So you get a penalty for that. So in 2 minutes, sorry, but so this is what you get. You get, in the rational model, you calibrate the base factor to 1. First, the behavioral models, basic and augmented for forward-looking, they have a base factor of 10 to the 5. So like it's a bit extravagantly bigger than 1. But anyway, it means the model really prefers a behavioral model compared to a rational model, even controlling for the number of 3 parameters. And then the M that the model wants is 0.7 for the consumers, 0.9 at the quarterly frequency for firms. Anyway, okay. Then the extended model, it's even less rational. Anyway, so this is, I'm not saying those are necessarily, anyway, so this is what the model tells you. So the model does prefer a behavioral model, again, consistent with earlier papers by Gali, Gertler, Rudebusch and company. But now it's done within that consistent intellectual framework where with both behavioral consumers and firms. Okay? So I won't to make too much of that, but anyway, you have a procedure to estimate that and just a traditional procedure and some baseline parameters to play with.
But here in the rational model, there's no serially correlated shocks. They're basically all IID, or
no. So sorry, I should do have a. Oh, I should have an extra slide on that. No. So in the rational model, let's say is the traditional equations plus an autocorrelated shock. So you add two of all those equations, like in the traditional procedure, an autocorrelated shock that could be model misspecification or something like that. Same thing in the behavioral model. Okay. Anyway, so great. Let me conclude on time. Anyway, you can get a bunch of other things, but let me not go there. You can get the neo-Fisherian effect. So this model, if you raise the nominal interest rate forever, in the short run, the model is, in the long run, the model is neo-Fisherian. Okay. So inflation will rise, but in the short run, you're going to have a big recession and inflation will fall. So the model is Keynesian in the short run and Fisherian in the long run. Okay, like any sensible model, I think. Anyway, quick comparison. Other models will give you parts of what I've talked about. So some models give you a deviation from non-Ricardian consumers. Hand-to-mouth consumers give you deviation from Ricardian equivalence. They give you OVMs equal to 1. The discounted Euler equation literature gives you M equals to 1, but the MF equals M less than 1. But the MF, they give you still rational firms. So the MF is equal to 1. Anyway, and it's also super tractable, whereas Mackey, Nakamura, and other more modern models, it's all fairly untractable if you want to get both equations. Anyway, so here it's a one-stop shop. You get for one parsimony assumption, lots of things. Lots of potential for future work, especially estimating the parameters and linking to surveys. And now I'm exhausting my time budget. But anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Any other questions?
So can I raise another issue? So Xavier, have you thought about heterogeneous beliefs? Here, everybody has exactly the same beliefs. That's one question. The other thing is, you compare it to the other models. If I just have an OLG framework, where there's a probability of dying and hence the discount factor moves around,
right? I
think it's much less flexible than your approach. But
but it's much more wrong. So let me tell you why. So by the way, I'm a big fan of the Del Negro, etc. paper from the Fed paper, from the Fed, New York Fed, who started a little bit this whole feature. Now, if you have probability of death, it does give you here an M less than 1, but our probability of death is like 2% a year. Okay, so de facto it's going to give you an M equals to like 0.98 annualized. It will give you a small deviation but very small deviation from m equals 1. Okay, so that's why it doesn't work. And there are some more subtle issues that Gali has worked out. Anyway, but basically on quantitative ground, you don't get it. And you have other papers looking at, maybe it's about liquidity. So, but again, on calibration grounds, M give you M minus equals to 1 minus the liquidity spread. And then it depends on the calibration, but from one calibration I've seen, it gives you N minus 1%. It gives you a 0.99. So it's very hard on calibration ground to get an M much less than 1. Okay. And another paper with misperception of GE, it gives you also an M. It has to be greater than beta, the pure rate of time preference. So greater than 0.99 if you want. So it's actually surprisingly hard to get an M substantially less than 1. Sorry, man, you get it here. And now, sorry, your other question, Marcus, was what?
In extrapolative expectations, would you get an M larger than 1?
So
or something which is larger than 1?
No. So the way I do it here, I say those agents, you want to have cognitive discounting and anchoring on the present. That's how I think about agents. If you really ask me, okay, you extrapolate on the present, but you also don't put a lot of weight on the future. And that, but like you said right here, if you extrapolate, the pure force of putting too much weight on the present tends to increase VM actually, and that's fine. Okay, so I think you need both. Yeah.
Xavier, did you look into the asset pricing implications of this a little bit? I mean, in the asset pricing, long-run risk models have been popular for some time, where you have these very small shocks to very persistent, say, expected consumption. Now, it seems to me as if this would all be basically gone.
So here, I'm totally silent about asset pricing. And in a very different projects, I'm thinking hard about, but it's not already, okay? I'm thinking very hard about asset pricing within attention or that. So this would not be a good model for asset pricing, because for asset pricing, you need to have some smart agents who think hard about asset prices and all that, okay? But here, when I think about those, it's a thing, but if you force me to write a model of a yield curve, here I would have a small fraction, 0.01% of the agents who, actually, Marcus, you had about heterogeneity. I'm going to come back to that, okay? So who think about the yield curve, and they would price the yield curve right in this model, which is according to the expectation hypothesis. So that's what you would get. But the important thing is agents, they will not try to, my consumers, they will still not try to use the yield curve to forecast the future better. They just don't want to bother, basically. So it would not change the agents, but it would change, asset prices a little bit. But to really fix asset pricing, you need a much more bigger fix than I'm doing here, and it's not in this paper. You need more. Okay. And now for Marcus's question about if you had heterogeneous agents, so suppose half are rational, half are behavioral. So to put it very roughly, if one has an M of 1 and the other one is F of 0.5, you get an M of roughly half in between. But it's not quite the case, because truly you get a model with 2 time scales, and you don't get the 2 equations. You need 3 equations, because you have 2 time scales. You need and it's totally doable. It's just more complicated. So here I say my strategy here is try to find a path from A to B, A being the rational traditional model, B being as simple as possible to use behavioral model. But once you see one path from A to B, there are lots of variant price to go from A to B prime. And some of them are in this online appendix. But you need one more equation, basically. Sort of the consumer, the consumption of the rational and the less rational people. It's more subtle, but sort of like.
I guess you have to keep track of the wealth share of these 2 guys.
And on top of that, you may have, it's not even the wealth share. So even if I, so to speak, didn't keep track of it, you would have this issue. So suppose you could imagine some lump sum rebates or whatever, so some dying probability that would eliminate the wealth share issues, but yeah.
So, Xavier, just a quick question here. On the price level targeting, I see there here, in the traditional model, what was important was commitment of the central bank that was important. Are you assuming here that the central bank is also facing this boundary rationality, or
no? So here,
more about what
here, in what I showed you here, it was the central bank could also commit. My central bank could commit, because I want to keep the complete parallel with the rational model. In both cases here, in blue and red, the central bank could commit, but with my rational central bank who can commit, but with behavioral agents, basically commitment is much less profitable, if you want. That's one way to think about it. And that's why you don't want to do this, price level targeting.
I see.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah.
Have you thought about extensions where the degree of myopia is actually driven by past experiences, like in the Nagel Malmendier type of framework?
Yeah. So I've thought about them, but not much more than that. So in this, in the new forthcoming version, Appendix 8, there's responding to 20 pages of useful, thoughtful referees anyway. I talk about endogenizing attention, and then it reacts to actually not past. I should add it actually. Past. I add a sentence. It reacts to future. If inflation becomes more volatile, so if macroeconomic conditions are such that inflation becomes more volatile, then endogenously the attention to inflation goes up. So that's what you can get. Okay. My take is those are useful, again, extensions, but you don't want to have all those extra bells and whistles in the most streamlined model, but it's useful to have them here. And the way that's where the details of my sparsity framework matter a little bit. It will be the case that if inflation volatility, let's say, doesn't really change very much within a range, you don't change your attention to inflation. But if it starts becoming very high, then suddenly your attention to inflation does increase. So it's within a range, you don't react to stuff. That's where the sparsity matters. Anyway, it's a bit of a detail for many things, but yeah.
So one thing I don't see yet, you had this beta delta formulation.
Yeah.
So where does it all, this two little m's, how do they translate into the big M? Why are both necessary, or?
Yeah. No, it's not necessary. So here I had, say, for the perception of interest rate depends on the slope, which was the M bar, and the intercept, which was the MR, and the intercept MY. So if we look at the big M, so let's look at it here. So you have the big M there, okay? So the big M, materially, it essentially just depends on the M bar. But then it depends a little bit on the MY, but by a very small amount, because it's multiplied by this interest rate of 2.5.
But let's suppose because you're estimating it later on in Bayesian fashion, if you go out some degrees of freedom, let's get rid of the little MY and only have M bar.
Yeah.
How would it do then?
Yeah. So in the macro Bayesian estimation, I just estimate the M bar. I don't try to go into the difference between the two.
I see.
Because I cannot actually. Okay. But anyway, but let me show you for the sigma. That's the attention to the interest rate. Okay, that's what really matters is the MR on quantitative grounds, is the attention to the interest rate. And of course, if I pay an attention of 0.1 to the interest rate, my sensitivity to the interest rate is multiplied by 0.1. So that's where. Let me show you one more thing that's maybe a little relevant for the calibration of central bank models. One of the difficulties in calibrating the New Keynesian model is the Phillips curve coefficient, the kappa here, is actually much smaller in practice than it should be in the rational model. That's one of the, okay? And so here what it is here in red, the kappa here, it's the coefficient in the rational model, which is this kappa bar that comes from degree of price stickiness, stuff you can observe, but times also the attention by firms to macroeconomic conditions. And so in the view of lots of people, a firm knows about its microeconomic conditions, but not necessarily that much, especially about future macroeconomic conditions. And so if you ask me to fix this parameter kappa, I would use up this 1 degree of freedom here of this attention by firms on macroeconomic conditions. And then for the looping on the endogenous attention, it could be that when inflation is stuck at 2%, firms don't really pay that much attention to macroeconomic conditions anyway. But if inflation becomes 10%, then you do pay a lot of attention, and this MF would become much bigger than in the calibration. I think I set it, I don't remember, at 1, but maybe it's true. I think I set it at 0.2 anyway. Maybe it goes from 0.2 to 0.9, I don't know. So again, I'm not really playing with it, certainly in the theory, but again, having in mind episodes, not just the past 25 years, but the broad spectrum inflationary episodes, this could be a useful parameter to play with, I guess. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? It seems like they're not, so I would like to thank, or we would like to thank Xavier for this really cool paper.
Thank you very much for having me.